Hello, Reynad, Hearthstone players, and loyal subscribers who hopefully are still going to be interested in this as card game players. I'm going to be responding to Reynad's recent video on interactivity and counterplay in Hearthstone, largely because I agreed with the video, and he ended the video talking about how there are some cards in Hearthstone, like secrets, that promote counterplay and interactivity, but it's difficult to imagine how to introduce more interactivity without the cards being secrets or the cards being played during your opponent's turn the way you can in Magic or certain other games. And obviously, Hearthstone is not designed to allow you to play cards during your opponent's turn, so that I think is out of the question. But first, I want to begin by addressing one particular reason why cards like Babbling Book and Swashbuckler probably exist, which is, first of all, I want to say I agree with Reynad that the cards reduce counterplay, but one thing that they do that is good is that they increase the card pool that you actually view in the game. And what I mean by this is if you look at a card game like Magic, there are thousands of cards. Probably easily like 10 or more times the number of cards in Hearthstone. But the number of cards that I have actually seen played, and I'm someone who's played for more than 10 years, is probably less than 10%. And that is partially because there are formats like Standard that restrict the card pool that you can use, but also because the large majority of cards are like utter crap. They're completely unplayable. And you will never see those cards played because there's nothing like Babbling Book or Swashbuckler to magically introduce them into gameplay. Like the idea behind, I think, Babbling Book and Swashbuckler is they can produce a card that you wouldn't ordinarily play with, like let's say Purify. Babbling Book can't make Purify, but Swashbuckler can. Makes a card like Purify that you would probably not ordinarily play in your deck, but you get to see the card and play with it in spite of that, which makes the game a little more interesting. But as for the idea behind Reynad's video, which is that it reduces counterplay, I agree entirely because, like he said, you have scenarios where your opponent's picked up a Brawl off of a random card, and you don't know whether the card they're holding on to is Brawl or Bolster, which potentially does nothing, and you can't really play around either of those because it's equal chance, and the window of cards or the range of cards that they could have is just massive. So how do you address this? How do you fix this problem? One way is to actually take a sort of direct approach to the fact that you have no idea what's in your opponent's hand because of the randomly generated card, and that's introduce cards that allow you to look at your opponent's hand. A lot of those cards exist in Magic, but there are very few cards in Hearthstone that interact with your opponent's hand. I believe Mind Vision is the only one. I'm going to quickly look that up. Yeah, Mind Vision is the only one that I can think of that interacts with your opponent's hand, and that puts a random card from their hand into your hand. In a scenario where your opponent has one card in their hand and that card was randomly generated, Mind Vision will tell you what that card is, whether it's a Bolster level card or whether it's a Brawl level card that you actually need to play around. But Mind Vision just isn't good enough, and it's unreliable, and it doesn't actually give you very much information because it only gives you one card from your opponent's hand. So I've designed a plethora of cards that you guys can look at. Keep in mind they are not balanced because, I mean, I don't have a Blizzard team testing these cards to see if they're fair, underpowered, or overpowered, so just bear with me. I think you guys will like some of them. The first one we've got, and they're all very similar. I'm using the same name. They're just different iterations of the same card, is Confession, 2-cost priest spell. Reveal your opponent's hand, draw a card. Very simple. And if your opponent is playing the Burglar Rogue deck, that takes a lot of the randomness, or at least unpredictability out of that when you're playing, which is good. Problem with the card that I could imagine is in Magic, when players reveal their hands, that's only for one turn. And then frequently at the competitive level, you'll have a piece of paper and you write down each of the cards. Or if you're playing online, you like screenshot it and put it in MS Paint so you can refer back to it. Just for the sake of keeping Hearthstone a more simple game, you could keep the cards that were in your opponent's hands at the time you played Confession revealed so long as they remain in your opponent's hand, but not reveal new cards that they draw. That's my idea behind the card. Moving on, we're looking at another similar card. And this is a more powerful version, I think, obviously. Reveal your opponent's hand, put a copy of a card from it into your hand. And this is good for two reasons. One is it's actually more playable because I think Confession is just kind of weak most of the time. It doesn't really do much. It's kind of like Purify, actually. But Confession gives you the potential to take a very vital card from your opponent's hand while addressing the fact that your opponent has randomly generated cards so that you know what's in their hand. But there's another layer to it, which is now you have a card in your hand that your opponent has information about. So if they had 3 cards in their hand, if they had in their hand, let's say they had Sylvanas, N'Zoth, and Sap, right? They now have the ability to play around any of those 3 cards. So it makes the game more interesting. It gives you cards that were not in your deck, but it allows both you to play around your opponent's weird cards and allows your opponent to play around your card, which is not random. It's actually generated by choice. So that's really good. The next one is based off of Magic cards. There are a lot of Magic cards that are called hand attack cards that let you take cards out of your opponent's hand and get rid of them. I think those are not, they're kind of anti-fun cards. They don't belong in Hearthstone because you could imagine if you played a card that's similar to Magic's Thoughtseize in Hearthstone and made your opponent discard their Cthulhu on turn 1, that would be pretty miserable for the Cthulhu player because they lost the core of their deck just to one card and there's no way to play around it. But this card that I've designed, Confession, again, you reveal your opponent's hand, once again addressing the randomness factor of randomly generated cards. Choose a card from it, shuffle that card into their deck, and then each player draws a card. And the reason I've got each player draws a card is because I think, first of all, I'd like there to be a you draw a card effect on it, just to make it more playable. But also, when you lose a card from your hand that your opponent chooses, one obvious drawback is that your opponent chose a card and you lost your best card. But the other drawback is you just simply have one less card in your hand, and adding the each player draws a card effect takes the bite off of the actual discard effect and turns it more into a temporary solution to a card, so that my opponent, if they have Cthulhu in their hand and they're at 10 mana, I can put their Cthulhu away and they might not draw it for a while. Whereas if it was just outright discarded, they would potentially just concede there because they don't want to play a game where their win condition is just gone without them even having played it. All right, and the last version is a minion version because I know people have been screaming for a Priest 2 drop for a while. So 1/5 stats I just kind of like threw on it. I don't know if that's balanced at all. It's got a lot of health but low power. Opponents play with their hands revealed. So as long as Pious Confessor is out, your opponent plays with their hand revealed. And that's, I think, a very marginal upside to a minion. So it seems pretty fair, but it also introduces a lot of counterplay options for the Priest player. All right, but now that we've talked about this, let's talk about the drawbacks of these, revealing your opponent's hand. I think the drawback to that is it can discourage your opponent in certain cases where, like, let's say I'm a warrior and I've been holding on to my brawl. I'm waiting for just the right moment to really blow out my opponent. If they see the brawl, then I know that they've seen it, and I have to kind of play the brawl just to get it out of my hand because I know they're going to play around it until it's gone. Uh, that's not a great feeling. And then the opposite end of the spectrum is the priest player. If they're playing against a hunter who's in top deck mode and hasn't got more than one card in their hand at any time since turn 5 or earlier, the reveal your hand effect is totally useless. So I don't know. It's just one possibility. But let's talk about a less direct response to cards like Babbling Book and Swashbuckler, which is instead of directly looking at the randomly generated cards, instead add different elements of counterplay. So the reason Reynad said that secrets have good counterplay is because there's a certain range of options that you know are set, and you can test and figure out what those options are. So you kind of have some insight into what cards in your opponent's hand. So one way to introduce more counterplay like that is to put cards into your opponent's hand that you know what they are, so to speak. And I've got an example of that. So I've, once again, not balanced, but we've made the some interesting version of Totem Golem. It's probably broken, but it's just a fun thing. Bottom of the food chain, it's a 3/4 for 2. It's a lot. But its battle cry is add a bigger fish to your opponent's hand. And then the bigger fish is a 4-cost 5/6 that destroys a minion that costs 2 or less. Hence, you can kill the bottom of the food chain card or another card with it. And then it adds the biggest fish to their opponent's hand, which is you again. And you get the legendary biggest fish, who is an 8-cost 8/9, who has battle cry, destroy a minion. And what's cool about these cards, aside from just the whole flavor theme of fish eating each other, is that while the card that you put into your opponent's hand is in their hand, you have something to play around because you know that card's there. Like, for example, if I play bottom of the food chain and my opponent gets the bigger fish, I might try to avoid playing extremely valuable 2-drops. Or I might even try to trade away my bottom of the food chain and then not have any more 2-drops. Like, get the bottom of the food chain killed and then only have 3-drops and 4-drops so that they can't use their bigger fish. Likewise, my opponent, when they play bigger fish, they have to make the choice to play this card or not, because if they play the card, then I'm going to get the biggest fish. It's a little fun. Adds more counterplay, potentially, or at least more interaction between you and your opponent based on what you happen to know is in their hand. But I've got a couple more examples for you guys. And these last couple examples I like a lot because in another one of Reynad's videos, he talks about types of choices available to players. And some cards introduce more choice. For example, Jeweled Scarab, Reynad points out, it has more choice involved than the Engineer card, because rather than just drawing a card, you have 3 choices. It's very similar to drawing a card, but there's a tiny bit more skill involved. And I like that a lot. But we're going to take that and also take into account the counterplay thing. And one thing that is, I think, a problem for Hearthstone is, although I can choose to play a deck that has a lot of choices involved with things like discover cards like Jeweled Scarab, my opponent might just play the 4-cost 7/7, the Totem Golem-esque Shaman deck that has next to no choices involved, but is just as effective as decks that are complex. One way to address these sort of brain-dead decks is to introduce cards that force your opponent to make choices. So as of now, the skill element is I make choices, and if I make the best choices, then hopefully I can overcome my opponent. But that's not always enough. Whereas if I have the ability to force my opponent to make choices, then I might be able to uncover whether they are a skilled pilot behind the 4-cost 7/7 deck, or whether they're just, you know, a dummy who happens to have overstated cards. The one example I think in the game right now is a card like Sylvanas, where there are certain board states where if Sylvanas comes out, you actually have to think a little about whether it's going to be better to try to clear Sylvanas and hopefully give them a weaker minion, or trade your whole board away until Sylvanas so they get 0 minions. Cards like that. But the card I wanted to talk about that I've designed is a counterpart to Jeweled Scarab, and also very similar to Swashbuckler and Babbling Book in terms of its stats. It's a 1-cost 1/1 Dung Beetle Battle Cry. At the beginning of your opponent's next turn, and the reason why it's at the beginning of their next turn is because if they had to do it during your turn, then it would be really weird with the rope situation, and your opponent could be alt-tab, so it's not a good idea. But at the beginning of your opponent's next turn, they discover a card for you. So your opponent looks at 3 cards and they choose the crappiest one, the Dung Beetleiest one, and put it into your hand. So Dung Beetle's a 1-cost 1/1 that kind of draws you a card, but the card's always going to be crappy. But what's good about the card is that it adds more choices to the game and it forces your opponent to make a choice. I think frequently the choice would be easy, but every once in a while your opponent might actually have to make a choice of playable cards that they will eventually have to play against. So you have that choice element, but even further, once again, we have the counterplay element, because your opponent now knows what card is in your hand. It's not random anymore. There's just so much more skill involved with the Dung Beetle card than the Swashbuckler card, because the Dung Beetle forces your opponent to make choice and forces your opponent to consider that choice they made until you play that card. It's a lot more interesting. And then lastly, I've got one more card I've designed, and this is based off of a Magic card called Vexing Devil, which also forces your opponent to make a choice. I think forcing your opponent to make a choice adds more interactivity and counterplay, and this card is similar. So it's a 1-cost 4/3 Demon Battle Cry. Add a Burning Vex to your opponent's hand. And Burning Vex is a 0-cost, do 4 damage, then do 4 damage to yourself. So the idea is that when your opponent plays Vexing Devil, you can immediately use Burning Vex to kill their Vexing Devil. Or you can hold on to the Burning Vex and use another piece of removal. Or you can save your Burning Vex as a part of a combo to kill your opponent if you're playing a deck like Freeze Mage, or a deck that runs spell damage minions or whatever. It's just a more interesting card. You could even make Vexing Devil into like it's like a crazy Flame Imp almost if you just immediately go face with it. But the point is that the better player is going to use Burning Vex better than the stupid player. The better player is going to know whether they need to kill Vexing Devil immediately, or whether they can afford to hold on to Burning Vex and use it later in the game. All right, anyways, that's all I wanted to say, is that I think there are a lot of options in terms of card design that would open up a greater depth of skill by introducing small choices that impact the game large amounts if you fuck them up. In addition to giving your opponent access to information, or getting access to information about your opponent's hand that lets you just play around cards more. And of course, the first examples, just reveal your opponent's hand, totally negates the unpredictability of something like Babbling Book or Swashbuckler. So I think I like these cards. I hope you guys like them. I hope you guys liked the video. I probably won't be doing anything like it again because I focus on a different card game called Infinity Wars. But if you're a card game fanatic, then stick around and check it out. And you know what? Like, might as well throw this out here. If you're looking for someone who wants to design games, I'm your man. Like, I would love to be involved in that, but it's just an unattainable dream, it feels like. So that's pretty much it. Peace out. See you guys all later, hopefully.